There is a kind of tiredness you can't see, a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from the body but from the soul. As if the simple act of existing with lucidity had become too heavy. You feel the whole world pulsing inside you. Other people's emotions, the city's noise, everyone else's urgencies, everything seems to pass through your field as if there were no boundary anymore. And what was once sensitivity is now overload. Carl Jung called this invisible psychological work the constant effort of sustaining consciousness amid the collective unconscious. The price of seeing what others don't yet see is high. You begin to notice pain between the lines, falseness in appearances, shadow beneath good intentions. And behind this lucidity there is a quiet loneliness, because no one taught you that light, when it finds no rest, also falls ill. The awakened soul does not tire of loving, but of trying to keep love alive in environments that no longer resonate. It gets tired of holding back, of explaining, of translating depths for distracted ears. It gets tired of pretending lightness when the weight of truth has become unavoidable. And sometimes this weariness feels like defeat, but it is not. It is the soul's call for a pause, the reminder that even the sun must set for the day to be reborn. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And perhaps the fatigue you feel is exactly that, the shadow asking for space within the light, the body asking for silence, the soul asking for rest. Chapter 1. When light becomes weight. There is a point on the spiritual path when the light that once set you free begins to weigh. At first, awakening feels like a blessing. Everything gains meaning, the heart expands, and there is a serene euphoria in grasping the invisible fabric of life. But over time, that same light that reveals also exposes, and what was fascination becomes responsibility. You start to see too much suffering, too much falseness, too many contradictions in the world, and most of all, in yourself. And what was once clarity becomes a subtle blade. It opens wounds, cuts through illusions, injures whatever innocence remained. Carl Jung said that consciousness is a fire that consumes, and the more it grows, the more fuel it demands, psychic energy, silence, presence. That is why many awakened ones feel the weight of their own light. It is the ache of someone who can no longer ignore, yet doesn't know what to do with so much seeing. You perceive masks, projections, unconscious games, and still you must keep living among them. The light that should liberate sometimes imprisons, because a conscious gaze doesn't switch off. The awakened mind becomes a radar, picking up invisible nuances, subtle vibrations, hidden intentions. And the heart, opening to love, also exposes itself to a flow of collective pain. Empathy becomes a portal of absorption. You feel the weight of the world in your own body, and the body, in its quiet wisdom, tries to tell you, enough, the light needs rest. But the spiritual ego, the one that wants to be always elevated, always centered, resists. It believes stopping is backsliding. It tries to keep the glow going, tries to stay high, tries to maintain peace as if it were a moral duty. And that is when light becomes a burden, because every energy, even the purest, must alternate between expansion and retreat. The sun illuminates, but it also sets. Consciousness brightens, but it also needs to dive into the dark to regenerate. When light feels heavy, it's because we've forgotten it isn't meant to be carried. It is meant to be lived. It isn't obligation, it is flow. It doesn't ask for effort, it asks for surrender. Spiritual fatigue is born when we try to sustain the divine with human force, when we want to illuminate the world without first resting within it. Awakening then reveals its other side, humility. The soul learns that even light needs the womb of shadow to be remade. And the awakened being begins, little by little, to understand that feeling tired is not failure. It is maturity to recognize one's limits. Chapter 2. The body as the soul's mirror. The body is the first to notice what the mind insists on denying. It speaks a language that precedes words, made of pulses, tensions, and silences. When the soul is depleted, the body begins to carry the warning, and many times we call physical fatigue what is in truth hunger of the soul. Carl Jung said that the body is the unconscious made visible. Everything we refuse to listen to in ourselves translates into symptoms, and every emotion that finds no voice turns into weight. That is why, when consciousness expands faster than the body can keep up, a misalignment appears, a tension between the mind's rhythm and the flesh's rhythm. The light wants to go on, the body asks for pause, and that discrepancy shows up as fatigue, insomnia, anxiety, diffuse aches, or simply a desire to disappear for a while. But the body is not failing. It is being faithful to the soul. It is saying, you need to slow down to remain whole. In Jung's symbolic language, the body is an oracle of the psyche. All that is unconscious in it seeks expression. When we suppress the call to rest, the body takes on the role of messenger and enforces pauses. Think of the times your body became the brake. A pain that made you stop, a fever that forced you to withdraw, an exhaustion that made you say no. In each of those experiences, there was wisdom. The body is the guardian of integrity. It protects the soul from our own haste, and when we resist listening, it speaks louder, not to punish, but to preserve. Spiritual awakening, without grounding in the body, becomes an electrical overload. The mind lights up the sky, but the feet lose the ground. That is why Jung held that every individuation process must include the body as an ally. It is not enough to understand the shadow. You must feel the shadow, allow the body to process what the mind discovers. Consciousness without the body becomes abstract. The body without consciousness becomes a prison. Only when both meet does true presence arise. The body is the temple where the soul dwells, and every temple needs care, quiet, and reverence. Listening to it is a form of prayer, breathing consciously, walking at a slow pace, eating with attention. All of this is spirituality in action, because at bottom, the body is not the obstacle to spirit. It is its echo, and when we learn to listen to it, we discover that rest is not the opposite of evolution. It is its most human, most truthful path. Chapter 3. The Spiritual Ego and the Myth of Control. One of the subtlest paradoxes of the spiritual journey is realizing that even when we believe we've transcended the ego, it's still there, only dressed in new clothes. Carl Jung called this the shadow of the spirit, the tendency of the ego to disguise itself as consciousness. And when that happens, the path to liberation can become yet another prison, now gilded, subtle, full of beautiful words and lofty intentions, but still a prison. After awakening, the spiritual ego weaves a new script. I must keep myself in peace at all times. I can't feel anger. I must be grateful all the time. I cannot allow myself to be tired. And so, in the name of light, the soul begins to repress its human parts again. The shadow returns, now masked as enlightenment. Fatigue, which was a call to rest, is interpreted as weakness. Sadness, which asked to be heard, is treated as a failure to keep the vibe high. And the pursuit of perfection becomes more exhausting than the unconsciousness that existed before awakening. Jung warned that whatever the ego seeks to master will later master it. When we try to control even the spiritual process, we create an unsustainable inner tension. The soul's natural flow moves in waves, days of expansion and days of retreat, moments of light and moments of shadow. But the spiritual ego wants permanence, to be enlightened, constant, impeccable. And in that rigidity, burnout is born. True spirituality does not demand purity, it demands honesty, allowing yourself to be tired, to doubt, to go quiet, that too is part of the sacred. Light does not go out when you lie down. It simply moves. It rests within you. Spiritual humility begins when we accept that consciousness is not a fixed state, but a movement. We are not here to sustain perfection, but to sustain presence, even when it is imperfect. The myth of control is the last veil awakening needs to tear, because consciousness, once it matures, stops trying to command life and starts dancing with it. And in that dance, every stumble is a step, every pause is a measure, every weariness is an invitation to breathe again. If you have felt that inner pressure to be okay all the time, share in the comments. Which feeling have you been repressing? Sometimes the simple act of naming what exhausts you is the first gesture of liberation. And if this video speaks to you, remember to like and subscribe so more seekers can find this space of truth and welcome. Chapter 4. Silence as Medicine. There comes a moment on the path when words become too small. Nothing seems to translate the density of what you feel. Explaining is tiring, justifying is draining, and even thinking feels noisy. That's when silence begins to call, not as absence, but as remedy. Carl Jung understood silence not as escape, but as the territory of integration. He said that the soul needs solitude to ripen. Without that inner space, consciousness fragments. With it, it is remade. We live in a time when everything demands an immediate reaction. Messages, opinions, answers, constant presence. But the awakened begins to perceive that the excess of stimuli is actually a form of collective anesthesia. Noise keeps us from feeling. And when we finally feel, we discover how exhausted we were from living outward. Silence becomes then a way home. An inner sanctuary where the self can breathe without witnesses. In silence, emotions find room to settle. The body returns to its natural rhythm. The mind stops trying to fix, and the heart begins to understand. It is in that space between one thought and the next that the soul speaks. But it does not speak in sentences. It speaks in sensations, images, memories, premonitions. Silence is the soul's native tongue. And when we learn to listen to it, life's entire frequency changes. To go quiet is not to step away from the world. It is to hear the world from within again. Jung believed that deep introspection, a dialogue with the unconscious, is what heals internal splits. In noise, we project. In silence, we integrate. In noise, we react. In silence, we understand. It is silence that turns information into wisdom. Perhaps this is why the ancient teachers withdrew before teaching, not to flee from people, but to heal their own listening. Wisdom that does not pass through silence is only opinion. But the kind born of retreat carries density, presence, and truth. When silence becomes medicine, everything shifts. You stop looking for answers and begin to feel direction. You stop trying to understand the world and begin to be whole in it. And the weariness that once suffocated becomes an invitation to pause. Each breath becomes a gesture of healing, each moment of stillness, a balm. Silence is where light rests without having to prove it exists. It is where the divine reorganizes within us. And when the world's noise becomes too much, perhaps the soul is simply asking for this, a bit of space to hear itself again. Chapter 5. The Inner Retreat. Relearning to nourish the soul. At some point on the path, the seeker realizes that silence is not just a refuge, but a home. And that home is not in a distant temple, nor in mountains or monasteries. It exists within each of us, waiting to be inhabited again. Carl Jung called this the self's center, the point where the human and the divine meet. The inner retreat is the way back to that center, the return to the soul's home. For a long time we were trained to seek nourishment outside, approval, distraction, achievements, recognition. But the soul's food does not come from what is external. It comes from states of presence, from small, quiet gestures that remind us who we are when no one is watching. To nourish the soul is to allow yourself to be simple. It is to rediscover pleasure in breathing, in hearing the wind, in existing without having to justify yourself. The inner retreat does not require physical isolation. It can happen in the midst of routine, in the seams of the day, in conscious pauses between one thought and the next. It is when, even surrounded by the world, you close your eyes and come back to yourself. This seemingly small gesture is revolutionary. In it, the unconscious and consciousness resume their dialogue. Chaos reorganizes. Self-love is rebuilt. Jung said, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. And equally, nothing blocks development more than the habit of not listening to oneself. And it is exactly this listening that the inner retreat restores. Listening deeply to yourself is an act of courage, because in the quiet you begin to perceive your own truths, those that can no longer be ignored, what needs to be left behind, what still hurts but wants to be understood, what was lost of yourself in the noise of others. To nourish the soul is then a gesture of reconciliation. It is allowing body and spirit to speak again. It is respecting inner time, the rhythm of breath, the cycle of the day, the flow of emotion. There is no healing without listening. There is no listening without pause. And there is no pause without the courage to be with yourself. In the inner retreat, we learn not to chase elevated sensations, but states of integrity. The simple becomes sacred, and solitude ceases to be absence and becomes communion. When the soul is nourished, the outer world changes texture. Your gaze softens. Words are needed only when they carry truth. You stop reacting and begin to radiate. Chapter 6. Weariness as a call to rebalance. There comes a moment on the journey when the body doesn't want to keep going. The mind tries, the ego insists, but something wiser within begins to say, enough. That enough is not failure. It is a boundary. It is the moment when the soul, tired of sustaining what is no longer true, begins to demand balance. Carl Jung saw weariness as a sign of the psyche seeking reorganization. He believed that when vital energy contracts, it is not because we failed, it is because the soul is redirecting the flow. Just as nature alternates between expansion and retreat, we too need winters in order to bloom again. Fatigue is not the end of the spiritual path. It is the gateway that leads to integration. When the body asks for pause, the spiritualized mind tends to resist. But I can't stop now. I'm so close to the light. I have to keep myself elevated. But the soul knows that all true light is born of the dark, and that every deep awakening includes a return to the earth. There is no illumination without grounding, and grounding begins when we accept fatigue as part of consciousness's natural rhythm. This state of exhaustion, physical, emotional, or spiritual, is how life teaches us to return to center. It is when everything scattered gathers back in, when doing gives way to being. In such moments, it is important not to judge yourself, not to force, not to rush. The soul has its own time, and forcing the rhythm is like trying to bloom in winter. Jung said the psyche is a self-regulating system. It creates symptoms not to punish us, but to bring us back into balance. Fatigue is one of those symptoms. It shows where we are giving too much, where we lost ourselves trying to sustain the impossible, where giving stopped being love and became self-abandonment. Recognizing this is the first step toward rebalancing. Behind weariness, there is always a quiet wisdom. It is the invitation to breathe differently, live more slowly, reconnect with the essential. It is the call to replace intensity with consistency, seeking with presence, ideal with truth. The soul doesn't want us to be tireless, it wants us to be whole. And little by little we understand, resting is not giving up. It is remembering. It is allowing life to pulse naturally again, without the interference of control. It is returning to existence the right to care for us. When listened to with love, weariness becomes a guide. It shows what needs a pause, what asks to be released, and what finally can be let go. Conclusion: the right to stop. There comes a time when the soul no longer wants to chase anything. It no longer wants to prove, understand, heal, transform. It just wants to exist, in peace, in quiet, in truth. And then we begin to understand. Rest is also a spiritual path. Carl Jung said that life needs pause as much as movement, because it is in the interval between beats that the heart finds its cadence. It is in winter that the earth remakes itself for flowering. And it is in rest that the soul reclaims the rhythm the world took from it. Allowing yourself to stop is an act of deep courage. We live in a culture that glorifies doing, producing, evolving without end. But consciousness does not bloom in haste. It ripens in the space that quiet offers. To stop is to remember that we are not spiritual machines seeking improvement, but human beings in constant breathing between light and shadow. You do not need to carry the world on your shoulders, nor remain awake all the time. The soul is not measured by how much light it holds, but by the quality of presence it offers. And presence is born from rest. Perhaps today your spiritual path is not to climb one more step, but simply to sit halfway up the stairs and breathe, not because you gave up, but because you finally learned that rest is sacred too. Light that rests does not disappear. It simply shines from within again. And when the world calls you back, you will be able to say, "Now I can walk again, but this time with soul." Share in the comments. What has your body been trying to tell you lately? Like, subscribe to Inner Sanctuary, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder. Resting is also awakening.